It was during the fall of 1997. I was supposed to bring my younger brother home, who was playing in the woods with his friends on a seemingly ordinary day. The kids were gathering on a particular spot, and they were noticeably rowdier than usual. Julian averted his eyes when he saw me coming, and he ignored me when I called him. My brother and I never really had a good relationship, but we grew more distant from each other ever since our father died. I was closer to our mother, while he was closer to father. After he passed, Julian became quite rebellious. My mother was still too devastated from losing her husband, and so I had to deal with my brother myself. I was about to snap at him as I walked towards him, but then I realized that Julian's bad attitude was the least of my concern when I saw what the ruckus was all about. I didn't notice it at first because the kids were crowding around the spot. I thought that they were just poking at a carcass of a dead animal or something silly that kids do to kill time in the woods. But then I saw a couple of them swinging twigs across the air instead. When I looked closely, the ends of the twigs would disappear whenever it passed a specific spot. I didn't understand what was happening until a boy threw a rock in that same space, and the rock just suddenly vanished mid-flight. I was doubting what I was seeing, but then the others threw anything they got their hands on in it, and nothing fell back down on the ground. Everything they threw at it just simply vanished into thin air. I asked them what was going on, but I couldn't see where they were pointing at. I walked around them so I could view whatever it was from a different angle, and it was only then when I noticed something strange. There was some kind of ripple hanging a couple of feet above the ground. It looked as if the space itself was distorted or bent like a wavy glass floating in the air. It was no bigger than a regular house window, and it was also as flat as a canvas frame. Whatever made contact with this strange ripple would disappear in space, and the kids were carelessly playing with it. Unlike them, I was so anxious about it that I was taken aback. Because of their innocence, they were simply amused by this anomaly like it was but a magic trick or an illusion of a show. I was completely perplexed by what I was seeing. I grabbed a broken branch from the ground and slowly passed it across the ripple. And just like what I saw earlier, the part that made contact with it had disappeared. I did it a couple of times while checking the other side up close, but it was vanishing completely, as if the farther end of the branch was entering a different space. It was returning back to normal whenever I pulled it back. I held it inside there for a while to see what might happen. When I pulled it back, the tip of the branch was slightly burned, like it was held up on a flame. It seemed there was something beyond this ripple in space, and it was dangerously hot. I adamantly warned the kids not to get too close to it, but they aggressively sneered at me for trying to get in the way of their enjoyment. They got even more curious when they saw the far end of the branch smoking. I grabbed my brother Julian away from it while scolding him for acting recklessly, but he pushed me quite violently and started calling me names. There were so many of them that I couldn't possibly stop them from doing what they wanted to do. I couldn't even get my own brother to listen to me. Even though I was at least 5 years older than any of them at the time, I was a feeble young man who was incapable of restraining a bunch of rowdy kids. One of my brother's friends, named Ryan, was dared by the other kids to put his arm inside the ripple. I yelled at him not to do it, but he did it anyway before I could do anything. I thought that Ryan's hand would burn like what happened to the branch, but he felt the complete opposite instead. I grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him away from the ripple, and I saw speckles of snow on his arm as if it was under heavy winter. Confused and in disbelief, the gang of kids pushed me out of the way while I was frozen stiff. They even got more excited when Ryan told them that the other side was cold. Although I was afraid, I also grew more curious how it suddenly changed from burning hot to winter cold. I was still very troubled by the fact that this inexplicable phenomenon was happening right in front of me. To make matters worse, it was surrounded by a bunch of careless kids. However, my fear was also gradually turning into astonishment and curiosity. I wanted to run back to town and fetch an adult to deal with the situation, but I was forced to keep my eyes on the children when another kid did something reckless a few moments later. Without saying anything, he stuck his face right into the ripple in space to see what was beyond it with his own eyes. However, what he saw was neither a cold nor a hot place. He also extended his hand across. When he pulled it out, he had a handful of leaves in his hand. He said that the other side was full of giant trees, and he said that he could hear the stream of a river nearby. I had my doubts at first, but this time around, it was undeniable that the other side of the ripple was leading to a completely different place each time a different person was making contact with it. It was a portal with no definite location on the other side. My theory was further proven when Jamie brashly stuck his head inside the ripple out of curiosity. I wanted to stop him, but he was standing right next to it while I remained at a safe distance. However, he didn't even last 5 seconds. He immediately pulled away from it, and his head was completely soaked. He said that the other side was not a forest, while he was desperately grasping for breath. He expected to see what the other boy had described earlier, but Jamie's head went underwater instead. He was choking since he drank too much, and the kids around him were just laughing. They still didn't realize the potential danger of this inexplicable phenomenon until what happened next. A few moments later, we heard a voice from afar calling out Jamie. His father, Mr. Morris, was looking for him. I was glad that an adult came to do what I couldn't do and take control of the situation. He must have been looking for his son for quite a while, since he sounded quite mad, and the kids were startled when they realized they were in trouble. I ran towards Mr. Morris to let him know our location. I told him what was happening in the simplest way I could. I told him about the ripple in space, and that it was a portal leading to random locations. But, like how anybody would have reacted, he laughed and brushed me off. I returned to the kids and was about to call my brother, but I ended up screaming when I saw him sticking his head inside the portal. I saw him take something out of his pocket and reached inside the ripple. I ran towards him as fast as I could, but I was too late. Mr. Morris was baffled by what we just witnessed, and I was completely heartbroken. I yelled and bellowed at the top of my lungs, hoping that my little brother would hear me and come back out, but he didn't. As tears flowed across my face, I mustered all the courage and took a peek inside the portal in hopes that my brother was on the other side. But the location at the other end had already changed. Instead of seeing my brother, what I saw through it was something that immediately shifted my tears of panic into crippling terror. The kids, who previously meddled with this enthralling anomaly of nature, were quite fortunate. It only showed them different destinations that were reachable to men. Apparently, the portal was not only limited to the world that we know. What I saw on the other side was a realm of grey where everything in my line of sight was covered in a smoke cloud. It was like a desert that was clouded with an endless wall of thick fog. The only part of me that crossed the portal was my face, but it was more than enough to feel the unnatural coldness of this disturbingly dreary world. It wasn't a kind that would dry my breath, but I could feel the chill creeping through the pores of my skin and down to my bones. Instead of the cold waft of unfamiliar wind brushing across my face, I was frozen by the overwhelming fear of an imminent threat coursing in my veins. There were no words to describe how profoundly frightened I was that I couldn't even move a single finger. My full attention was absolutely absorbed by the silhouette of a colossal creature in front of me. The dreadful atmosphere was already haunting as it was, but what completely petrified me was the otherworldly entity that roamed amidst the clouds of fog. I couldn't get myself to believe that a being that was so far beyond my wildest imagination would actually exist, and this majestic titan cannot possibly live amongst us, since its slightest movement would cause a large-scale calamity. Its size was not that of the largest animal in history, nor the largest structure built by man. It was far greater and not a single living thing on Earth would have the courage to ignore its imposing presence. It was the size of a big mountain, and I couldn't fully recognize its features clearly. Since it was taller than my eyes could see, I could tell that it had a long body based on its silhouette. Its upper mass was set higher and much wider than the lower body, like a crouching ram, and the head had 6 webbed horns, arched upwards like a crown. It also had 6 legs, and 4 of them were positioned at the front with reversed joints to support its uneven weight. This majestic titan was moving fairly slow, and there were bizarre 4-winged avian creatures coming in and out of the fog as if they were traveling with it. Unfortunately, I was too focused on the giant that I didn't notice the other inhabitants of this eerie world, which were already right in front of me. I was caught off guard. I didn't know that they could see me as well, since the kids who previously peeked through the portal did not encounter anyone nor anything. I was utterly shaken when I saw these terrifying fiends facing towards me. I couldn't tell if they could see me at first, since they didn't have any eyes, but then they started to approach. Their bodies had the shape of a human walking on all fours, but their limbs were disproportionately long and extended far apart like a lizard. Their skins were pale, with a faint purple hue, and there were black spikes sticking out of their spines. There was nothing on their faces but a lipless mouth that opened from ear to ear when they started to shriek. There were 3 of them, and they were coming at me. My worst fear about the ripple in space just suddenly occurred. A door would open both ways. If we could get in, then the ones on the other side might also get out. I moved away immediately when the horrifying fiends were getting closer, and then its long fingers started creeping through the ripple as if it was testing it. I was too terrified that my knees gave out while every inch of my body was jittering. I was stuck on the floor with my eyes wide open as the otherworldly creatures crawled out from the ripple. The children screamed at the top of their lungs, and Mr. Morris was scared out of his wits as well. He was yelling for me to get up, since he was reluctant to come any closer, but my body was so shaken that I was completely petrified. One of the fiends walked right in front of me. As it was looking down on me, it suddenly stood on 2 legs, like it was trying to imitate a human. And when it did, I realized that it was far taller than I initially thought. With its long limbs fully stretched, it reached a height of roughly 11 feet. Both its feet and hands had the same shape like an ape with far longer and skinnier digits. Its jagged nails and serrated teeth were sharp enough to tear me to shreds. I laid there completely helpless in front of this hideous beast, too afraid that I couldn't even let out a scream. It bent over and took a closer look at me while grating its teeth. When it pinned me on the ground with one hand, I knew right there and then that I was done for, as my head was stuck in between its fingers. If Mr. Morris wasn't there to help me, that would have been my bitter end. He threw a rock at the fiend, just as it was about to pierce its fangs into my face. As it got distracted and turned its head, I instinctively ran my hands across the ground and desperately searched for anything that I could defend myself with. Luckily for me, there were a lot of branches lying around which the kids used when they were playing with the portal. In a timely manner, I grabbed a branch and stuck it into the fiend's mouth while it was screeching. It agitated the monster, and it aggressively shoved me off the ground. I was thrown several feet away. The last thing I remembered was the agonizing pain of my broken ribs before I blacked out. In a way, I preferred to stay unconscious whether I was dead or alive. I thought I'd rather be dreaming instead of dealing with the nightmare that was happening in my real life. I came to the woods to bring my brother home, but so many things happened in such a short period of time. I was beyond overwhelmed. I felt hopeless. The chances of finding my brother seemed so slim. He could be anywhere, and he could be in danger. To make matters worse, there was also the possibility that he ended up in a place that was not of this world. I had an idea where he might be based on what I saw before my brother disappeared. Julian took out his yo-yo from his pocket before he stepped inside the ripple, and it looked like he was showing it to someone. It was the last gift that he received from our father before he passed away, and he always had it with him to remember him by. Based on his actions, it was possible that the portal had crossed into the world of the dead. He might have seen father there, and he decided to come after him. I should have forced him to go home with me, even if he might hate me for it. Mother was still deeply heartbroken for losing father, and to lose her son as well was simply too much for her to bear. I was worried when the kids were playing with the portal, but it was me who made the otherworldly creatures come out of it. I was only trying to do what I thought was right, but it was due to my actions that things got worse. I had no idea how long I was unconscious. I actually thought that I wouldn't wake up again. The next thing I knew, I was awakened by the sounds of several gunshots. It was the first confirmation that I was still alive, and it was also a sign that things got worse since I passed out. When I opened my eyes, I found myself at the town's hospital with my mother crying at the bedside. Apparently, Mr. Morris brought me back after the dangerous encounter in the woods. A couple of armed hunters came to our aid when they heard the children screaming, and it bought us enough time to get away from the fiends. Unfortunately, more of them came out of the portal, and they had already reached the residence. The authorities and hunters are doing what they could to fend them off, but the darkness of the night made it hard to hunt even an ordinary critter. A number of townsfolk had already fallen victim to the savagery of these uninvited visitors. When I looked out the window, I saw 3 officers on the street frantically trying to put down a single fiend that was leaping from one roof to another. There were puddles of blood and decapitated limbs all over the ground. The majority of the residents in the town were old people and children. They had no means to defend themselves against these pale monsters that were much fiercer than the animals of the wild. Along with the wounded and the weak, we remained hidden inside the hospital while armed folks were struggling to keep the fiends away. The gunshots were loud and sharp, but the bellows and screams of agony were more prevalent all over the town. Some of the hunters who got injured after encountering the fiends were also in the hospital, and they told me how difficult it was to kill just one of them. The skins of these otherworldly beasts were impossibly thick, and they had to use piercing rounds just to cause some damage. Even by doing so, they were extremely resilient. The hunter said that the rounds they used could kill a rhino with a single shot, but the fiend took dozens of bullets and slaughtered 2 of his friends before it dropped on the ground. When it died, its remains deteriorated rapidly until it turned to ash. In my mind, perhaps that was the reason why their world was covered in grey. What I thought was a sea of sand might have been a mound of corpses. The town's mayor already asked for assistance from the nearest city, but it would take a while before they would reach us. We had to fend for ourselves, and the casualties were piling up in every passing hour. We feared that we might get wiped out before the night would be over. There were at least 7 otherworldly fiends roaming inside the town, and there were more of them lurking in the forest. These creatures were incredibly agile, and it was hard to track them down since they were moving very quietly. According to the fortunate individuals who survived the encounter, the creatures were more curious than hungry. Some of the victims were disemboweled without getting eaten, as if they were only toyed with. At least 4 armed men equipped with heavy rounds were needed to take down just one of the pale fiends. With each close encounter, the beasts were taking down at least 2 men in each group, while the ones who survived were badly injured. We were severely outmatched. Our numbers were decreasing much faster than theirs, and more of them were coming out from the forest as the night progressed. They were no primitive beasts either. It seemed the first ones were meant to test the waters. When they realized they could dominate us despite our numbers, more of them started coming in. Despite their brutality, there was a clear display of intellect in the way they infiltrated the town. The waves of screams indicated that they were already breaking into the households. Since most of us inside the hospital were injured, we were in grave danger as well. The wounded hunters had radios with them. They were receiving updates from their comrades about what was happening outside, and it did not sound promising at all. One by one, the hunters stopped receiving updates from their comrades, To make matters worse, the groups that were assigned to hold the fiends outside of the town suddenly came in our line of sight. They all retreated from their posts as 2 officers barged into the hospital. They told us that a large pack of fiends were about to arrive, and it was no longer safe for us to stay there. The patients who could still walk helped the ones who couldn't. I tried my best to remain composed while we were walking past the ruptured bodies of our neighbors. Unfortunately, we were spotted by one of the fiends while we were on our way, and it was then I witnessed their horrifying brutality with my own eyes. It sprung out from the roof and lunged towards one of our escorts in a blink of an eye. The spring in its long limbs was akin to a spider's. It moved so swiftly and quietly that it was already right in front of him before he could even react. Aside from its agility, its presence alone was horrifyingly intimidating. Just like what happened to me in the forest, the officer was frozen stiff when it was already looking down on him. Without wasting any time, it held him in place with its hands and coiled its long fingers around his body. The officer was a middle-aged man with a fairly muscular physique, but there was nothing he could do as the cruel beast sank its jagged teeth right into his head. If I wasn't helped back in the forest, the same thing could have happened to me as well. The fiend cracked his skull effortlessly, and the other officer shot its head point blank when he saw an opportunity. I thought that he had it, but the pale beast did not even bleed and was only agitated by the jolt. The remaining officer told us to run, and so we did, while screaming our hearts out. Overwhelmed by fear, we unhesitatingly left him behind to save our own skins. We went to the main hall, and all the remaining survivors crammed themselves in there while the armed folks surrounded the building to protect the rest of us. As the pack of tall monsters were approaching, the hall was filled with cries and desperate prayers. My mother held me tightly in her arms, and so did the other parents to their children. Without mentioning it to one another, every single person inside the hall had already accepted their imminent death. All of a sudden, we heard heavy vehicles approaching. The fiends let out a deafening screech along with the large sounds of exploding grenades. Help finally arrived, just in the nick of time. The army came to our aid, and they carried enough firepower to extinguish the otherworldly beasts. Aside from their vehicle-mounted weaponry, they also had flamethrowers, which drove the fiends away. Once all of them were pushed back to the forest, they bombarded them with tear gas, which forced them to crawl back into the portal. Strangely enough, it looked to me as if they knew exactly what to do in this kind of situation. The army handled everything else the morning after. The entire town was placed in quarantine, and they burned all the remains of the victims, since the fiends turned to ashes when they died. They also brought a cage in an attempt to capture a living sample. However, the only one that they had immediately killed itself when it failed to escape. Since the fiends turned to ashes when they died, they were unable to retrieve any evidence of their existence. I wanted to go back to the ripple in space in hopes that I could still save my brother, but they barricaded the area and did not allow anyone to come near it. A few days later, men in black suits arrived. They confiscated the records from the residents who managed to take pictures and videos of the fiends. They visited every single household to collect their statements that concerned the otherworldly encounter. All the cameras and video recorders were taken in exchange for a hefty compensation. It felt that we had to comply with their requests, since we owed our lives to them. Given the situation, we were in no position to refuse. They stayed in the area for 5 months. I went back to where we saw the ripple right after they left, but it was no longer there. Journalists eventually came to write about the inexplicable incident when they heard about it, and it spread across different media platforms. However, the story wasn't taken seriously since the records we had were all seized. The military refused to say anything about the matter as well. The horror that befell upon our town was eventually reduced into nothing more than a legend that nobody believed in. We were taken for fools and liars. But, despite what everybody says, the terror of that particular night is forever etched in my memory. I still keep on visiting the spot in the forest to see if the ripple will appear again. I'm still hoping that my brother will return one day. On the other hand, I'm also aware of the possibility that what might come out from the portal are horrifying beings that are not of this world.